And
US President Barack Obama embarks this week on a four-country tour through East Asia. He's not visiting China. In fact, the four countries he is visiting all each have territorial disputes in the South China Sea with China. Those countries are Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Malaysia. And it seems that one of the main topics in each of these countries will be closer military ties with the United States. To discuss this tour, what the President is hoping to achieve and how it will be received within the region, I'm joined now by Brendan O'Connor, who's from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Thanks for your time. Firstly, why is President Obama making this trip? What do you think he's hoping to achieve?
Well, these types of presidential trips, particularly to allies, are about reassurance, creating goodwill, trying to deal with some specific issues on trade with Japan, trying to deal with this issue of naval rights at the Subic Bay base in the Philippines. The first trip to Malaysia for 50 years, Lyndon Baines Johnson was the last US president to go to Malaysia. So it's an attempt to, I think, bring Malaysia into trade relations, make the Malaysians
Which
maybe
is
say
an
things.
important regional player, Malaysia, in the context of East Asia, given that President Obama missed the East Asia Summit and ASEAN about 6 months ago.
Very much indeed. I mean, it's this Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. Malaysia's been quite a player in that. It's obviously quite a player in ASEAN. So I think Obama wants to see Malaysia on side with the United States, maybe making some of the arguments the United States would like to make with regard to Japan, that Malaysia can help the United States in that regard, and also present Malaysia as a bit of a model. This is probably extending the argument beyond the reality, but I think there has been a US tendency to see Malaysia as a model of a Muslim democracy, and so there'll be an attempt to meet with sort of democratic forces within Malaysia and try to push that agenda.
Now, he's not going to China, but it seems China will be top of mind, or at least top of the stories that come out of this. Do you think that this will be in the background or foreground in a lot of these talks?
Yes, I think for all of the nations he's meeting, China will be on the agenda. I mean, South Korea seems to have improved its relations with China over the last sort of 4 to 5 years or even longer, where Japan, they're much more strained. I mean, you could argue there's fault clearly, I think, on both sides. The Japanese maybe need to recognise some things about their history that they haven't. The Chinese aggravating things, and the Japanese over these basically these rocks, islands, the Senkaku Islands, that there's been disputes over. So there's many things to deal with Japan. I think it's Obama's third visit to Japan.
This dispute over the Senkaku Islands, Diaoyu Islands, as the Chinese know them, the Japanese seem to believe their US treaty obligation with the United States would see the Americans come to their defence in the event of any conflict with China, and want some reassurance on that. Do you think the United States really, I know it's hypothetical, but do you think the United States really would come to the military support of Japan in such a dispute?
Well, I think that goes back to the reassurance point I made at the beginning. I think there will be an attempt to say something which reassures Japan, but then hopefully moves that issue totally off the table. So I think it's not obviously the kind of issue the United States wants to spend an enormous time thinking about, but it's an important issue to the Japanese. So it's one of those tricky things.
Well, he has to be very careful, though, doesn't he? Because the Chinese will be watching whatever he says extremely carefully.
Reports out of the United States press suggest there will be some reassuring words from Obama, that there's support for the Japanese, that there'll be reassurance that the United States isn't going to cut its military budget in ways that won't be good for North Asia, that won't be good for the Japanese and the South Koreans. But these islands are not known by a lot of people in the United States. They're not something that the people of the United States want to see a military conflict over. So I think Obama will be very, very sort of mindful of that as well.
And the Philippines are looking for a stronger military relationship, stronger military cooperation with the United States as well.
Very much so. I mean, I think the Philippines have come back into the United States camp over the last 10 years or longer. When we saw the Philippines in a period moving away from being comfortable about United States bases in the Philippines, I think that mood has now changed. I think at Subic Bay there will be a want to maybe for the Americans to maybe commit more naval forces to Subic Bay. So I think that relationship is strengthening as very much the Philippines want to see the United States playing a kind of buffering role, supporting role, and see the Chinese as having, territorial ambitions in the South China Sea, seeing them having a zone, a military zone that the Philippines, the Vietnamese, and many others are pretty uncomfortable with.
When you put all that together, and we'll see what the US does in relation to the Philippines and these other countries, together with what is happening here in Australia with the Marines, the small number that are based in the top end, in the Northern Territory, how do you view the so-called pivot to Asia? Many have said that it's been forgotten, put in the bottom drawer. The US has been distracted still in the Middle East, now in the Ukraine as well, Syria. Is the pivot to Asia still happening?
It is happening, but it seems to happen in kind of fits and starts. I mean, Ukraine will be the huge issue of the week in the debate in foreign policy circles in the United States. Obama's press secretary Jay Carney gave a briefing a day ago, and all the journalist questions were largely about Ukraine. There was one question about China of substance, but most of the discussion was about the Ukraine. So whenever the United States wants to talk up the pivot, things occur in the Middle East which cause problems, things occur in the Ukraine, or there's budget crises back home, or shutdowns so Obama can't visit. So it hasn't been a very clear message in terms of the leadership of the United States, John Kerry or Barack Obama, looking like they're focusing on this as the number one issue that they should be concerned about in foreign policy. Now, there's many realities which make it the number one issue, and there's a lot occurring beneath the leaders' level. But I think there's been a definite image problem with this pivot, and this visit, I think, is an attempt to try to overcome that image problem.
It's been said, too, that the US has been left looking rather impotent after what Russia was able to do in terms of Crimea. A lot of talk of sanctions, but in the end, the annexation has happened and it's worked. How do you think that will be seen across Asia, in particular with the concerns that some of these countries he's visiting have with China and its territorial ambitions?
I mean, it's a very interesting point. There's been a lot of commentary in the Japanese press about this, I think some nervousness, but I think the Ukraine is a fairly unique situation. I don't think it's one that would want to bring an analogy into other areas. It was part of the Soviet Union, there's a very large number of people who identify as Russians in the Ukraine, particularly in the Crimea. So it's a much different issue to say a sense that China is going to move into territorial areas in, say, not just waters, but force its influence on the Vietnamese or the Philippines. That's a much more complex issue. I mean, some have described it as a potential Finlandization, that it's going to be difficult to, argue that the Chinese shouldn't have a sphere of influence as the Russians or the Soviets once had. But I think it's a much different issue to dealing with something which is on your land borders. Having to go across sea, I think, creates complications. And I think South Korea is a good story here. That has obviously closer land connections to the Chinese, and its relations with the Chinese, I think, are probably better than they've been, possibly in the history of South Korea.
Brendan O'Connor from the US Studies Centre, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much for that.
My pleasure.